Hey guys, you ready to get back to reading Harriet? I sure am. Okay, we're ready for chapter 10. It's called The Final Trips. So I'm going to read it to you, and then you're going to have a quiz to take on Skyward. And if you need to go back and listen to this again, you will be able to do that. Or you can also look at the pages too, that might help you. Okay. So during the late 1850s, Harriet continued sneaking back to the land of Egypt, as she called Maryland, and leading slaves to the promised land of freedom. She'd taken field hands, cooks, and housemaids. She'd taken their young children and their tiny babies. But now, she had a new kind of passenger for her train. These passengers wouldn't be able to wade across rivers or walk through swamps all night. They couldn't run quickly if there was danger. These passengers were Harriet's elderly parents, Ben and Rit. Harriet had some disturbing dreams about them. Then she found out that Ben was in trouble. She had to take them up north. But to do it, Harriet had to come up with some new ways to travel. Trusting in the Lord to help her as always, Harriet set out for Maryland. When she reached Bucktown, it was daylight. She hoped that she wouldn't run into Dr. Thompson. But just in case, she invented a disguise. First, she bought 2 live chickens and tied them by their feet with a cord. She tied the cord to her belt. Next, she pulled her wide sunbonnet down to hide her face and stooped over when she walked. Now she looked just like a little old woman taking her chickens to market. As she was rounding the corner, she saw Dr. Thompson on his horse heading right for her. Keeping her head down, she yanked the cord holding the chickens. Away they flapped. Harriet waved her hands in mock distress and ran after them. Dr. Thompson laughed as he watched the scene. "Go, Granny," he called after her, never suspecting that this woman had once been his property. Harriet hid in the nearby woods until dark. Then she made her way to Ben and Rit's cabin. Softly, she knocked on their door. Rit let her in. Harriet was worried that her mother would be so overjoyed to see her that she'd cause an uproar. But Rit simply hugged her and told her about Ben's trouble. Another of Mr. Barrett's slaves, a man named Peter, had tried to run away. He hid in Ben's corn crib. Ben never went to the corn crib except when it was pitch dark, so he never saw Peter. He put some food into the corn crib for him. After a few days, Peter changed his mind about running away. He went back home. He told his wife where he had been. His wife thought maybe she could gain favor with Mr. Barrett, so she told him that old Ben had helped Peter. Now Dr. Thompson and Mr. Barrett were calling Ben up to the big house every day. They were questioning him. Rit was afraid that they might sell him south or put him in jail. Harriet had arrived in the nick of time. When her father came home, Harriet again thought how her parents had aged, even in a few years since she'd seen them. How was she ever going to get them all the way to Canada? She decided she would need a horse. Harriet told her parents to get ready for a trip. So an important thing to think about on this page is how Ben had been helping Peter, but it said he never saw him. So it's kind of like when Ben had gone out to see Harriet and the boys that one night, his 3 sons, in an earlier chapter that we read. You can tell, well, we can infer from this, using what we know already, that he just didn't look at Peter because he didn't want to be able to say that he saw him. He wanted to tell the truth, so he wouldn't look at people he was helping. But they found out anyway that he was helping them. Okay, let's go on to the next page. Then she walked over to the Barrett plantation. There she found an old horse named Dolly May. She coaxed the horse to her feet and rode her into the woods. Harriet tied Dolly May to a tree not far from Ben and Rit's cabin. Harriet scouted around until she found an old pair of carriage wheels on an axle. She fastened a board over the axle and, with rope, hung a second board down below the first. Now the old people could sit on one board and rest their feet on another. After dark, Harriet hitched Dolly Mae to her makeshift wagon. Then she ran to get her parents. Ben brought an axe. Harriet carried the feather comforter that she had made. With these few belongings, they sat up onto the wagon seat. Harriet took the reins, and off they rode into the night. All night long they traveled north in the crude wagon. At daybreak, Harriet pulled far into the woods, and they slept. That night, they headed north again. They traveled on for 2 more nights. Finally, they arrived in Wilmington. There, Harriet's old friend, Thomas Garrett, gave the 2 people money and train passes. Ben and Rit rode in comfort the rest of the way to Canada. Harriet couldn't go with them. It was too dangerous for her to travel out in the open now. By night, she traveled to Canada on foot and in friends' wagons. She met her parents in the little town of St. Catharines. Ben and Rit were free. Harriet settled her parents in her small rented house. They spent a hard, frigid winter there. Ben and Rit were not used to cold weather. When spring came, Harriet moved her parents down into a little house on South Street in Auburn, New York. It was risky to settle there, with the fugitive slave law still in effect. But Harriet had many powerful friends in New York State. She knew they would help her if she was in trouble. Harriet had always lived on very little money herself. She used her earnings for her trips to Egypt land. But now she had parents to support. She took several part-time jobs. She sometimes spoke at anti-slavery meetings and was able to earn extra money. When Harriet traveled to one of these meetings, she carried letters of introduction. She also took along pictures of the friends who arranged for her to speak. When she met new people, she would show them a picture. If they could name her friend in the picture, Harriet knew she could trust them. Shy at first, Harriet soon became a fine speaker. She had a wonderful memory and was a natural storyteller. She held her audiences spellbound with tales of her narrow escapes, leading slaves to freedom. By 1860, the United States was very close to war. People living in the states in the North disagreed violently with those living in the states in the South. Slavery was one of the main issues. Now the pro-slavers wanted all the freed blacks returned to their masters. More slave hunters than ever roamed the highways in the North. Every day, runaways were caught and sent back into slavery. Of course, Harriet didn't let the danger stop her from going where she wanted to go. That year, she was traveling to Boston to speak. On the way, she stopped to visit a relative in Troy, New York. There, Charles Nall, an ex-slave, had been caught by a slave hunter. He was being held at the courthouse. His hearing was about to begin. A commissioner would decide if Nall should be sent back south. A group of abolitionists waited in the square outside the courthouse. Pro-slavers waited too. There were about 1,000 people in all. Tempers were high. Harriet had the feeling that something important was going to happen. She arranged for a boat to be waiting on the riverbank, just in case. Then she had some little boys run around the town shouting, "Fire! Fire!" Soon, alarm bells began to ring. Just as Harriet hoped, more and more people poured into the square. Harriet pulled down her sunbonnet once again. She bent over like a weak old woman. No one who saw her could have imagined how strong she really was. Acting like an old lady, Harriet elbowed her way through the crowd. She made her way past the guards until she was inside the courtroom itself. Suddenly, from the crowd out in the square a voice from the crowd out in the square called, "We will buy Nall's freedom. What's his master's price?" The slave hunter walked to the courtroom window. $1,200, he called out to the crowd. Someone in the crowd began collecting money. Wealthy people gave generously. Poor people gave what they could. Little by little, $1,200 was collected. "We have raised $1,200, the voice announced. The crowd cheered. The slave hunter went to the window again. It had not taken these people very long to come up with $1,200. No doubt they could come up with more. $1,500, he shouted. What a greedy cheat, going back on his word. The crowd was furious. They pressed forward. Inside the courthouse, the commissioner told the guards to lead Charles Knoll away. He was an escaped slave and must be sent back south. That was the law. The guards began to take the handcuffed Knoll out the door, but the old woman suddenly sprang forward. She ran to the window. "Here he comes!" Harriet shouted to the crowd. "Take him!" Then Harriet ran out of the courthouse. General Tubman began giving orders to the crowd. "This man shall not go back to slavery," she shouted. "Take him, friends. Drag him to the river." Harriet pounced on one of the guards holding the prisoner. He hit her head with a wooden club. But Harriet never flinched. She took Knoll's arm and slipped her hand inside his handcuff. Attached to him, she pulled him through the mob. A little farther on, a guard knocked Harriet and Knoll to the ground. Harriet quickly snatched off her bonnet. She put it on Knoll's head. When they stood up, no one could tell where Knoll was in the sea of people. Harriet pulled Charles Knoll through the crowd of people, waving clubs and firing pistols. At last, they reached the Hudson River. Back in the courthouse, the commissioner saw what was happening. He telegraphed the police station on the other side of the river. As the boat carrying Harriet and Knoll landed on the opposite shore, many policemen were there to meet them. They recaptured Knoll and put him in jail. But the angry abolitionists had crossed the river too. They marched to the jail and threw rocks at the door. The policemen fired their guns into the crowd. "They can only kill a dozen of us," someone shouted. "Come on." More shots rang out. People were killed. At last, a very large black man pushed open the prison door. But the sheriff was waiting. Inside, with a hatchet. He swung the hatchet, splitting open the big man's head. The man slumped to the ground dead. His big body blocked the door. The sheriff couldn't close it. A wave of people rushed in. Harriet was among them. They grabbed Knoll a second time and carried him out of the jail. On the streets, they hailed a man driving by. When he heard their story, the man jumped down and gave them his horse and buggy. The abolitionists drove Knoll out of town. Knoll was safe, but Harriet was in more danger than ever. The police were looking for the little old lady who'd started all the trouble. She could be arrested. So her friends hid her just outside of Troy. They nursed her battle wounds. 2 days later, she traveled to Boston to keep her speaking engagement. Harriet made another trip down to Maryland that year. She brought out a couple and their 2 small children. But by now, every road, north and south, carried a poster of Moses. The pro-slavers wanted her blood. Harriet's friends convinced her that now was the time to stop her trips. She was too important to the anti-slavery movement to get killed. She was far more useful alive. Okay, so now what you guys need to do is you need to get on Skyward and take your quiz over this chapter. And if you have any issues with Skyward, you can just, I'm going to put actually on, I'll put on Google Classroom a paper copy of it. It would be easier to do it on Skyward if you can, but if for some reason it doesn't work, I will put a paper copy on there that you can do if you're having issues with your Skyward. Okay,